You wake up and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Not a metaphor, not a mood. The smell. Wet straw, animal dung, smoke that never quite left the room because there is no chimney, only a hole in the thatch, and last night the wind was wrong. You share this single room, not a house, a room. With your parents, your siblings, 2 goats and a pig. The pig is not a pet. The pig is this winter's margin between survival and starvation, and you sleep next to it the way a modern person sleeps next to their phone. With urgency, with dependency. You are 7 years old. You have already outlived 2 of your siblings. In medieval England, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years, not because people aged faster, but because so many died before they ever had the chance to grow old. Historians analyzing skeletal records from burial sites in London and across Northern Europe have documented that a substantial proportion of individuals interred in pre-Black Death cemeteries were children, infants, toddlers, children who made it to 5 and then didn't make it to 10. This is not a myth of the Dark Ages. This is documented demographic reality, cross-referenced across multiple centuries, multiple regions, multiple sources. Every second child born in medieval Europe across a span of hundreds of years did not survive to reach adulthood, many dying in infancy, many more before age 5 in ordinary years without plague or famine. Read that again, 1 and 2, not in years of plague, not in years of famine, in ordinary years. In the background radiation of medieval daily existence, children died at a rate that a modern person cannot hold in their mind without it slipping away. Because nothing in your lived experience gives you a frame for it. You have never watched a sibling buried before their 3rd birthday. You have never considered that the child sleeping next to you tonight might not be there by spring. That was the medieval baseline. And here is the thing about baselines. You adapt to them or you die, failing to. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why a modern person, you specifically, with your indoor plumbing and your antibiotics and your unconscious assumption that hospitals exist, would almost certainly not survive a single full day in the medieval world. Not a week, not a month, 1 day. Because it is not just the violence or the disease that would kill you, it is the system. The entire structure of medieval European life was a machine that demanded everything from the overwhelming majority of its population, the 85 to 90% who were peasants, serfs, and unfree laborers, and returned almost nothing. This is not a history lesson. This is an intervention. Let's begin. You imagine medieval people as rough but vital, hardy, close to the earth. People who worked with their hands and were tough for it. Here is what you are actually imagining: a fantasy. Sanitation in medieval towns and villages was catastrophic by any measurable standard. Human waste was discarded into streets. Animal waste was discarded into streets. The streets were the streets, the sewer, and the public space all at once. Medieval towns had no infrastructure for waste removal, no pipes, no treatment, no systematic disposal. Animals, pigs, chickens, cattle, moved freely through living areas. Historians and archaeologists studying medieval urban sites have confirmed the dense, near-universal presence of intestinal parasites in the remains of people at every social level. Lice, fleas, roundworms, tapeworms, not occasionally, chronically, as a baseline condition of being alive and living among other people. And here is the part that stops most people cold. Medieval physicians working from ancient Greek humoral theory, the dominant medical framework for nearly 2,000 years, genuinely believed that bathing was dangerous, that warm water opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease. This was not ignorance, it was doctrine. Medical doctrine, taught in universities, prescribed by educated practitioners, followed by people who were trying their best with the knowledge available. The deliberate avoidance of water was a medical recommendation. Tooth cleaning involved abrasive powders, often charcoal, that removed surface staining while slowly eroding enamel. Odor was managed not with soap or perfume in any modern sense, but with substances made from animal fat mixed with herbs, creating a layered competition of smells that would, to a modern nose walking into a medieval home, register as something between a farmyard and a garbage pit on a warm day. Close your eyes and imagine that smell. Hold it. Now understand that you would not notice it after 3 days because you would be part of it. You picture a medieval feast, a long table, firelight, haunches of meat, bread, tankards of ale. You've seen it in 100 films, 100 games. The hearty simplicity of it, the rough abundance. The feast existed for lords, for clergy, for the top 5% of the social hierarchy on special occasions. For everyone else, for the 85%, the reality was pottage. Pottage was a gruel, a thin, monotonous paste of oats, barley, dried peas, and whatever plant matter could be foraged or grown in the kitchen garden, day after day after day. Not varied, not seasoned beyond what a small herb plot could provide. Meat was rare enough to function as an event, not a meal, an event, something that happened at festivals, at harvest, at slaughter time, and then not again for months. Water was frequently contaminated with agricultural runoff, animal waste, and the same biological material that made medieval streets so hazardous. Salt, critical for preservation, essential for flavor, was expensive enough that it was sometimes used as a medium of exchange. Preservation itself was crude and often failed. Meat heavily salted past the point of palatability, stored in conditions that modern food science would classify as actively dangerous. A chronicle from 1315, the opening year of the Great Famine, recorded that grain prices quadrupled within a single season as relentless summer rains prevented 3 consecutive harvests from ripening across northern Europe. The same chronicle noted that even royal households struggled to source bread. Ordinary households didn't struggle. They starved. Documented accounts from famine years describe people consuming bark stripped from trees, leather boiled until soft enough to swallow, and the carcasses of animals that had been dead for days. There was no refrigeration, no food safety infrastructure, no supply chain to call upon when the local harvest failed. And the consequence, the chronic, grinding, year-in, year-out consequence, even in non-famine years, was that diarrheal illness caused by contaminated food and water was one of the leading causes of death across all age groups, not a seasonal risk. Not a worst-case scenario, a permanent feature of medieval biological existence. Your gut in this world was always at war. And it was a war that a modern immune system, entirely unprepared, entirely unacclimated, would likely begin losing within hours of your first drink of water. You think people got sick, but they survived. Herbs, remedies, folk wisdom passed down for generations. Medieval medicine was not limited. It was, in many documented cases, actively lethal. The most widely practiced medical intervention in Europe for nearly 2,000 years was bloodletting. The deliberate removal of blood from the body of a sick person using lancets or leeches applied to specific veins, based on the theory that illness was caused by an excess or imbalance of the 4 humors. A person already critically weakened by fever and infection who underwent bloodletting was not helped. They were made catastrophically worse. They died faster and more thoroughly than they would have if left alone in a dark room. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia. Patients were held down by assistants. Alcohol was sometimes administered beforehand, not enough to block pain, enough to dull the edge of awareness slightly. Screaming was not exceptional. It was expected. It was the sound of medieval surgery. Barber surgeons, the same practitioners who cut hair and pulled teeth, performed wound closures and amputations with unsterilized instruments, moving between patients without the concept of contamination because the germ theory of disease was 500 years from existing. Without that knowledge, infection following surgery was not a complication to be prevented. It was an expected phase of healing, a sign, some believed, that the body was purging itself. The leading killers in medieval Europe were not the Black Death, which, despite its fame, historians of medieval epidemiology now estimate ranked somewhere between 7th and 10th in overall cumulative disease burden, because it struck periodically rather than chronically. They were tuberculosis, killing slowly and comprehensively across all demographics. Dysentery, operating as a constant undercurrent of child mortality. Respiratory infections, taking the very young and the already weakened with quiet efficiency year after year without chronicle or drama. There was no aspirin, no antibiotic, no intravenous fluid. If you fell seriously ill in the medieval world, and you would quickly, because your immune system carries no memory of the specific pathogen environment of pre-modern Europe, your options were a cold room, a prayer, and a physician who might, in trying to help, finish what the illness started. You picture a cottage, stone walls maybe, a fire, rustic and intimate, the kind of space a modern boutique hotel would charge you $400 a night to simulate. Most peasant homes were single-room structures built from wattle and daub, a wooden frame packed with a mixture of clay, sand, and straw, sometimes reinforced with animal dung, pressed into woven lattices and left to harden. Thatched roofs, dirt floors. No glass in the windows, shutters at best, that blocked light as thoroughly as they blocked cold. A central hearth in the middle of the room provided heat and light. For most of the medieval period, and in the homes of the poorest peasants well into the later centuries, there were no chimneys. Smoke rose from the central hearth and escaped through gaps in the thatch or not at all. Furniture was minimal in ways that defy modern spatial imagination. A rough-hewn table, benches, straw piled on a dirt floor as a sleeping surface. In winter, to preserve heat and protect valuable livestock from freezing, animals were brought inside. The goats, the pig, whatever else the family kept, their body heat was genuinely necessary. You needed them there, and everything that came with them, the waste, the smell, the fleas moving through the straw in the dark, was simply the price of not freezing. Bedbugs, lice, and fleas were not occasional visitors to be dealt with and expelled. They were permanent residents, permanent as the walls. Sleep in this environment, in the smoke, in the cold that still came through, despite the fire, with animals shifting against you in the dark, insects moving across your skin, was not rest in any recognizable sense. It was biological maintenance, your body repairing itself just enough to function through another 16-hour workday, not recovery, not restoration. Survival at minimum viable level, this was home, and you could not leave it. Understand something clearly. The hardship of medieval peasant life was not an accident of circumstance. It was not bad luck or bad weather operating on otherwise free people. The suffering was structural. It was designed, enforced, and inherited. The system did not simply produce misery, it depended on it. Historians estimate that between 85 and 90% of the medieval European population were peasants, and that the majority of those peasants lived under some form of serfdom or villeinage. A serf was not a slave in the chattel sense, They were not owned as property and could not be bought and sold independently of the land. But they were legally bound to a specific estate. They could not leave without their lord's permission. They could not marry without the lord's formal consent. A daughter who married a man from a neighboring manor required authorization, which required a fee, which had to be paid before the marriage was permitted. If a serf wanted to move to the next village, 1 mile away, they needed written approval that was rarely granted and sometimes impossible to obtain. Their children were born into the same status automatically, without negotiation, without exception. The cycle did not break. It reproduced itself, generation after generation, as reliably as the harvests it depended upon. In practice, a peasant family worked their assigned strips of land from before sunrise to after sunset during peak agricultural seasons. Historians of medieval labor have documented summer workdays of up to 16 hours during peak harvest periods from before sunrise until dark, with brief breaks for food. Of everything they produced, every bushel of grain, every animal raised, a portion went to the Lord as tax, not a voluntary contribution, an obligation enforced by the law of the manor. Additional obligations called labor dues required peasants to work the Lord's personal fields, not their own, the Lord's, for specified days each week, regardless of what was happening on their own strips. The harvest on the Lord's land came first, always. What remained after taxes and dues was subsistence at best. In bad years, after a failed harvest or a severe winter, it was not enough. There was no legal recourse. There was no court of appeal available to a villain in a dispute with his lord. There was no union, no minimum wage, no inspector who arrived to ensure standards were met. If peasants refused or failed to meet their obligations, the response was not administrative. It was physical, flogging the stocks. In some documented cases, mutilation. Public punishment was not an extreme measure in medieval legal practice. It was the standard tool of social control, applied visibly and deliberately to reinforce the hierarchy that everyone already understood but occasionally needed to be reminded of in terms they could feel. Religion in medieval Europe was not a personal practice. It was not optional. It was not separate from daily life. It was the operating system of reality itself, the framework through which every event, every disaster, every unexplained death was interpreted and assigned meaning. The Church controlled hospitals, education, legal processes, enormous quantities of land, and the interpretation of natural events. When the Great Famine struck in 1315, crop failures so severe they lasted until 1317, with food shortages lingering in some regions until 1322, hundreds of thousands died across northern Europe. The theological response was not an investigation of agricultural practice. It was intensified prayer, public penance, and a deepening fear of divine judgment. The Church also held the most powerful psychological lever in the medieval world, the threat of eternal damnation. Excommunication, formal exclusion from the Church, meant death without last rites, burial outside consecrated ground, and the complete removal of the deceased from the community of the saved. To die excommunicated was to die with no hope of heaven, no legitimate burial, no intercession of the saints. For people who genuinely, completely, without reservation, believed in the literal reality of hell, and the overwhelming majority of medieval Europeans did, this was not an abstract theological sanction. It was a terror that operated on lords and kings and peasants alike, giving the Church coercive authority over behavior at every level of society that no army alone could have produced. This fear was not exceptional. It was daily. It was the background noise of medieval consciousness. the anxiety that you had not confessed something, that you had worked on a Sunday, that the fever in your child was not random illness, but specific punishment. Understand what it means to move through the world with that weight, to interpret every misfortune as moral evidence, to have no framework for separating natural cause from divine judgment, because the framework for making that separation had not yet been built. The hardship so far described, the disease, the hunger, the physical labor, the legal subjugation, applied to everyone. Women carried all of it, and then carried a layer on top. In most medieval legal contexts, a woman was a dependent, first of her father, then, upon marriage, of her husband, then, if widowed, of male relatives or the direct authority of her lord. She could rarely own property independently. She could rarely initiate legal action in her own name. Manor court rolls from medieval England confirm that widows and single women were held legally responsible for the land obligations and labor dues previously assigned to male members of their households. They were required to perform the same feudal obligations, while simultaneously holding almost none of the legal rights that would have given them standing to contest or negotiate those obligations. They did the work. They bore the burdens. They had almost none of the protections. Childbirth was among the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age. There were no trained obstetricians. There were no sterile environments. There were no instruments designed specifically for safe delivery. Birth was attended by other women, midwives and neighbors, whose experience and skill varied enormously and whose tools extended no further than what their hands and their knowledge could accomplish. A complicated birth, a malpresentation, a hemorrhage, a prolonged labor was a death sentence. A slow one, in a dark room, surrounded by people who wanted desperately to help and had almost nothing to help with. Even if a peasant family navigated all of it, the disease, the hunger, the feudal obligations, the crushing systemic weight of poverty and legal subjugation, even if by extraordinary fortune they had enough to eat and remained healthy through a full season, they were still entirely unprotected from the randomness of violence. Medieval warfare was not fought by professional armies in designated fields, concluded in a single day, and then cleared away. It moved through the landscape, through villages. Raiding, pillaging, and the deliberate burning of crops were standard military tactics, not accidents of war, but instruments of it. Destroying an enemy's food supply and agricultural infrastructure was how you won, which meant that a peasant family whose village lay anywhere near a military campaign, which was not rare, because medieval warfare was frequent and geographically diffuse, had no warning system, no evacuation route, no protection. What took a year to grow could be burned in an afternoon. What took a generation to build could be ash by nightfall. Banditry on roads made travel genuinely dangerous. Walking between villages, attempting to flee a failed harvest or a cruel lord, attempting to find work or family, meant moving through territories where armed men operated without meaningful constraint. There was no police force. There was no national law enforcement. Local lords provided order within their estates and nowhere else. Outside the estate walls, outside the village boundary, you were alone in a way that no modern person in a developed country has ever been genuinely alone. And so here you are, a modern person, dropped without preparation into a world that is cold, dark, and loud with things that can kill you. Your immune system carries no memory of the specific pathogens saturating this world, in the air, in the water, in every mouthful of food. You have no knowledge of how to perform 16 hours of agricultural labor. You have no experience of a world without recourse. without a hospital, a pharmacy, a hotline, a legal system that at least nominally treats you as a person with rights. You have no psychological framework for the ambient terror of a world where illness is divine punishment and death is always 3 bad harvests away. You would not last a day, not because you are weak, because the world was designed to extract everything from people who were stronger than you, more adapted than you, more experienced than you, and it still killed half of them before they turned 5. So next time you turn on a tap and clean water comes out without thought, without effort, without risk, without the knowledge that you are drinking something that might kill your child, understand what you are holding. That tap represents centuries of accumulated engineering, public health infrastructure, political negotiation, and the slow, grinding movement of human civilization away from the baseline described in this video. The antibiotic you take for 3 days when you have a bacterial infection, the one that works so reliably you barely think about it, would have been considered miraculous beyond comprehension by any physician who ever practiced medicine before the 20th century. The infection it cures killed people for thousands of years, not dramatically, slowly, in pain, in dark rooms, attended by people who loved them and could do nothing. You can leave a job you hate. That legal right, the right to simply walk away from labor that does not serve you, was not available to the majority of human beings who have ever lived. It was fought for, legislated into existence, defended. It is not natural. It is not inevitable. It is a specific historical achievement. It was not given. It was taken slowly from people who did not want to give it. Your refrigerator, the food inside it that will not kill you, the absence of livestock in your bedroom. Life today has its own difficulties, real ones. Economic pressure, chronic illness, exhaustion, the particular grinding stress of the modern world are not nothing. They are not trivial, and this video is not arguing otherwise. But they exist on top of a foundation of medical, sanitary, legal, and nutritional infrastructure that represents the accumulated labor and suffering of every generation that came before, including the medieval people whose lives we have just examined. They did not build that foundation consciously. They built it with their bodies and their deaths and the slow, terrible accumulation of hard-won knowledge about what kills a person and how to stop it. They paid for the world you live in with everything they had. The least you can do is know what it cost. What shocked you the most? Leave it in the comments. I want to know which part of this world you couldn't quite hold in your head. If you have ever complained about something that, in a medieval context, would have been an unimaginable luxury, and you have, we all have, hit the like button, not as a joke, as an acknowledgement. And subscribe, because this channel exists to change how you see the world you already live in. The next video will do exactly that. The medieval peasant who broke ground before sunrise this morning, who will work until dark, eat pottage, sleep in smoke, and bury a child before the year is out, never had the chance to know that the world could be different. You do. And you almost never think about it.